All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to APUS History, the first video podcast of the year. And today we are going to look at Spanish conquest and colonialism. So let's get our presentation up and running and let's go. The Spanish conquest. We are going to talk about a major historical moment. We're going to be looking at why we shift from Columbus and his settling to the entire movement of Spaniards and the conquistadors taking over of Mexico and most of Central and South America. Long story short, we do know that there is a moment where the islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, they're running out of slaves for their plantations and for their work. And so they start to do the occasional slave raiding to the mainland across the ocean. And that's when they start to hear stories. These slaves bring back stories of fabulous wealth and kingdoms full of gold. And that's when we will move into the beginning of the Spanish conquistadors and New Spain. Two quick things that are worth mentioning. The Treaty of Tordesillas, that was 1494. That helped bring some peace between Portugal and Spain. The Pope basically said that Portugal could have half the world and Spain the other half. Nobody else was really included, so it's a bit odd, but hey, what are you going to do? And we also like to talk about the three G's, God, gold, and glory, and some like to add, but mostly gold, right? And as we go into this discussion, I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to check out the John Green Spanish Colonialism crash course. He does a much better job than I do, but I'm going to try to cover some of the key things that maybe details that get left out. So Spanish colonialism, we can divide it into two phases. The first phase, the conquest, and then the second phase, the settling. And our first phase is roughly 1519 to 1540. And this is the phase you can see here in this map, starting with Cortez and moving into some of the other early conquistadors. With these guys, we're pretty serious about their business. They had this thing called the requerimiento, excuse my bad Spanish, and it was actually this rule that you had to go and offer Christianity and a chance to be part of the Spanish kingdom to the native peoples. And then if they didn't answer, yes, we'll take all of that, then you had the right to attack and kill and decimate and destroy. They would say this line, the resultant deaths and damages shall be your fault, not the monarch's or mine or the soldiers. Forget about the fact that they might not have spoken Spanish, but hey, what are you going to do? Now let's talk very quickly about Cortez and the fall of the Aztec Empire. As we've discussed already, we know that the Aztec Empire had conquered all of these other regions and was already in a period of decline. Then we have Cortez. Here's the famous painting of Cortez meeting Montezuma. He's in his fancy armor and all dressed up and ready to go. I'm not going to go into all the details of the story, but I do want to mention some of the key points. The idea that at one point they describe him as having conquered all of the Aztec Empire with only 500 men. Of course, 500 men plus some, I don't know, anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 or even more soldiers that were helping him, natives, people who had been conquered by the Aztecs. What we can mention briefly is this incredible capital city. I'm not good at pronouncing this one, Teotihuacan or something like that. And it was the biggest city in the world at the time. The Spaniards were amazed by the beauty, and they were going to come in later and pretty much destroy it. This is a nice Aztec drawing, and we do have lots of documents and descriptions, and we'll do some document work in the classroom where we talk about different views and different perspectives on how the Aztec are conquered. Got ahead of myself there. What we do know is that after the conquest of the capital and the destruction of the capital, we're going to see this unbelievably rapid destruction of the Aztecs from 20 million people to 2 million people in less than a century. And it starts with the 4 months of fighting, but then it is followed with disease. And the disease spreads like wildfire. It's even far more destructive than the armies of Cortez. And why does the disease spread so fast? There's a couple of key reasons that we want you to be familiar with. The Europeans came from a history of lots of long-distance trade. The Central American kingdoms had trade, but not the kind of long history of trading with Africa and Europe that we saw in Asia in the Western Hemisphere. We also have a greater degree of widespread urbanization. This one has lost, I think, some of its favor in the theories because, well, we had some pretty big cities in North America and it didn't seem to help them much. But we need to add to it the domestication of animals. Scientifically, I'm not going to go into details, but we know that when more animals are domesticated, it leads to more sharing of disease and then building up of resistance to disease. And I think this last one is probably the most important. War, poverty, and also environmental crisis like drought leads to a weakened people, more susceptible to disease, and then more likely to be getting sick and dying. And so you take all of this together, and you have a pretty catastrophic fall of the Aztecs and some other empires. Here's an old colonial drawing of disease eradicating the Spaniards. Now, two important concepts. Encomienda. This is the idea that when a Spaniard would get a piece of territory, he got the slaves that went with it, or the people that went with it became his slaves. So he got all the profits from everything that they were creating. And that's going to be a really controversial practice later. And then we also talk about the Columbian Exchange. And this is a great little chart that shows that while the Europeans brought a lot to the New World, we were also taking a lot from the New World back to the Old World. Some really important things, too. Things like the corn and the potatoes, food that becomes the mainstay of most of the world, really. Also, a lot of gold and silver taken out. You'll notice there's just one disease, that's the syphilis, that comes from the New World to the Old World, whereas the Old World brought lots of diseases to the New World. Smallpox, measles, the plague, the flu, typhus. Didn't seem to be a very good deal in the end. Africa gets kind of the short end there, too. You can see just slave labor, not so much going back the other way, although the New World foods do go to Africa and become some of the main staple crops. This is a great phrase from a classic American history textbook we used to use in my class. He says, "Yet the invader brought more than death. He brought crops, animals, language, laws, customs, and religion, and he intermarried with the surviving Indians." Yeah, I suppose it is worth mentioning and noting and understanding, and it leads us right into the idea when we talk about conquistador immortality. And this is our phase two, the 1530s, 40s, 50s, the spread from Mexico into South and Central America. And conquistador immortality refers to the idea that, well, there weren't a lot of Spanish women who came, and so the conquistadors mixed and intermarried by force or who knows what. But the majority of Central and Southern Americans will be the mestizo or the mixed race people. And we'll get into that one a little bit more later. We are going to talk now about the first real settlements of the New World. I don't know how well you can see this, but it's a great drawing from Spanish colonial era. And if I could use my pointer, I would show you that you've got a group of natives, and then you've got these priests. And all the labor and all the work seems to be done by the priests. I'm not really sure that's what it looked like on those plantations. And the natives are gathered together in the middle to learn about the religion. And then in some other corner, if you could see, there's some danger and violence going on to some of the priests, but they're continuing and working hard, and they're going to teach the so-called savages. It gives kind of a good idea of how the Spanish saw themselves and what they were doing. The spread after Mexico, after Cortez becomes the richest man in the world, it becomes a really popular idea. Let's go to the New World and let's try to find our own gold and get our own kingdoms and our own land. And so we have a famous expedition in 1528, a Spaniard named Narvaez. But Narvaez, his expedition is a complete disaster. His boats crash, he dies. The only survivors are these fellows, Cabeza de Vaca, and he's got a great name, it does mean the cow's head, and his slave Esteban. We see a few other men here, but as far as I know from the story, in the end, it's just the two of them. And the two of them have this incredible journey. You can see here they crashed near Tampa Bay, and then they're going to wander all the way by foot through southern America. They're going to southern United States of America. They're going to go up through Texas, and they're going to walk around through Mexico, and it takes them a long time to get back to their so-called civilization, Mexico City. And during this journey of 6 years, these guys at sometimes were slaves, at other times they were seen as medicine men, at other times they were traders. But what's important about these guys, and here was a fairly bad movie that was made about them, was that in 1542 he published a book. And in his book, he talked about the wonders of what he saw on his journey. And one of those was the 7 cities of Cibola, or Cibola, however it's pronounced. And he talked about how there was vast wealth of gold. He never saw it, but he just heard a lot about it. And this will set off a new race because everybody wants to be as rich and successful as Cortez was with all of the incredible gold and silver of the Aztecs. So, what happens? We have Coronado. This is a famous name. Have you heard of Coronado? Coronado, we've got Coronado High School here in Colorado Springs. I Googled Coronado and I got like 1 million hits of Coronado High Schools and Coronado Hotel in California. He's somebody that we tend to honor in the United States. But what did he do? What did Coronado accomplish? He came looking for the famous cities of Cibola. He wanted to find the gold. He wanted to be that next Cortez. He was the consummate conquistador. And this map shows his route. He comes up from Mexico. They didn't pack hardly any food at all. They had a plan. They were going to force the natives to feed them. And that's what they did. They would arrive in a village. They would demand to be fed, but it was a time of drought. So the natives would often refuse. So then he would have to fight. They would kill many people. It was a violent and bloody conquest. They marched forward. And what would you say if some crazy guy came in and was going to kill you if you didn't tell him where the gold was? You'd say, it's that way. Yep. And so they kept going. And they kept going. And they made it all the way to Kansas. Right? And this was the supposed location. And one of his guides at this point thought that he was safe. They wouldn't kill him because they needed him to get home. Of course, they didn't understand that Coronado had compasses and was navigating, would be just fine and able to find his way home. Well, he does eventually make it back to Mexico. No gold, a total failure. He is actually, in the end, considered a criminal by the Spanish government. He was considered so violent towards the natives and his own crew that he will be taken back in chains to Spain and prosecuted. Now, some say it was because he was trying to get too powerful and they were afraid of him, and there is some degree of truth to that. But in the end, he does end up more or less clearing his name. But you're not going to find a lot of monuments to Coronado in the same way we talked about Columbus earlier. There's another fellow I'm not going to go into great detail about, and that was Hernando de Soto, who did a similar journey, although this guy was in a slightly different side of North America. He's going to wander through Mississippi, Arkansas, and back. He'll see the Mississippi River, be the first European to describe it. He was, quote, given to the sport of hunting Indians on horseback. He was a brutal and violent explorer, and we know that he counted 30 native towns along the Mississippi. When the French, who were the next Europeans to arrive, went to the same area, they only found 5 villages. His war and spread of disease had wiped out an enormous amount of people and had affected a huge area. And he too found no gold and came back more or less considered a criminal, not having been successful. And then, of course, there's one more famous name, and this is Pizarro meeting Atahualpa in the Incan Empire down in Peru with his 180 men, and how many others I don't know. They will crush the Incans in Peru. And here's a little map that shows you briefly 1532, 1533. So it's a quick spread, right? It's a very rapid spread through South America and Central America. And that's when we start to talk about what impact these colonies will have on Spain and on Europe at the time. So let's just go briefly here. The Encomienda, these enslavement. Cortez, by the way, 23,000 families were considered his slave. And it was this hated, brutal system. At the same time, we have development. And they had the University of Lima and Mexico City. These are in the 1550s, before Europeans even settle in what we now call the United States of America, the English, the French, and whoever else. They're already building universities in Central and South America, so they're way ahead of the game. An enormous and immense amount of wealth comes back to Europe, and especially Spain, in the form of gold. Does this help the Spanish economy? Not so much. There are those who become incredibly wealthy, but it leads to sort of a neglect of the middle class and the farming class because they can buy whatever they want. And it eventually leads to a major economic crisis, and Spain and Portugal will end up paying for their early successes by kind of becoming an afterthought in the world of colonialism and European power. Almost immediately after the success with all this gold, we have the development of European piracy. There's all these ships bringing back the Spanish gold, so we're going to imagine that a great way to get wealth quickly, don't worry about exploring the New World, just go and get it from the Spaniards. Why not? And so the pirates, well, not so much pirates like this one, but of course he's one of our favorite pirates. There you go. Nope, wait a minute, Captain Hook, that's not quite the right kind of pirate either. Anyways, the pirates will be at one point taking as much as half of the gold of the Spaniards. Still, they were bringing back enough for it to be worth their while. Let's talk about permanent settlements. Right here you've got a map of St. Augustine, Florida. This will be the first permanent settlement in North America. St. Augustine, 1565, makes it the oldest European developed city in North America. And here's a little picture of it. Here's the original Spanish fort. They suddenly were in a hurry in the 1560s to settle because there was some competition. The French were coming in. The French came in and they set up Fort Caroline, and the Spanish were not so happy about this, and so they went and they invaded the French. You'll read a primary source document on this one. They went and invaded, and they killed, and just pretty much every single Frenchman. There was a couple of survivors who pleaded to be saved because they may have been Catholic, whereas the rest were Protestant, and therefore they were wiped out. And that wraps up the initial introduction and brings us to the next topic, which is this idea of the settlement of the Southwest, rebellion, and the Black Legend. But we'll save that for later. Thank you very much.